If you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you my life was as close to perfect as you can get. My name's Mike, and I've been married to Jennifer for almost 18 years. We live in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone waves hello when they walk their dog. Our two kids, Sarah and Josh, keep us busy with school activities, and I thought we had it all. Steady routines, good jobs, and a stable family life. It wasn't flashy, but it was everything I thought I wanted. Jen and I met back in college. I was instantly drawn to her. She had this warmth about her, a kind smile that made you feel like everything was right with the world. After a few dates, I was hooked. We got married pretty young, but I never doubted my decision for a second. Jen was the type of woman who cared about family above all else. She didn't want a big career. She wanted to be home with the kids, and I respected that. It worked for us. I handled the finances, and she managed the house. For years, we were like a well-oiled machine. Jen has always been clear about everything. She never hid her phone or acted secretive. In fact, if I ever needed to check her phone for something, maybe to grab a number or reply to a message for her, she'd hand it over without hesitation. That's the kind of trust we had. We didn't have the kind of marriage where we were constantly checking up on each other. She was straightforward, and I had no reason to doubt her. We had a system, and it worked, or at least it did for a long time. Over the last couple of years, though, things started to change. At first, I didn't think much of it. Life gets busy, right? The kids were getting older, and Jen started visiting her parents more often. Her folks live about an hour away, and they were getting on in years. It made sense she'd want to help out more. At first, it was just day trips. She'd drive out, spend the afternoon, and be back by dinner. But then, slowly, those trips turned into overnight stays. Then entire weekends. She always had a reason. Mom's back has been acting up, and she needs help around the house. Or Dad's not doing too great, so I'm staying a couple of days to keep an eye on things. It all seemed completely reasonable. I never questioned it because Jen was that kind of person. She was thoughtful, always wanting to take care of people, especially her family. But if I'm being honest, over time, those weekends away started to wear on me. Not because I didn't want her to help her parents, but because the house just felt empty without her. The kids were older and more independent, so they didn't need constant attention. I'd spend my weekends getting things done around the house, catching up on work, but it always felt like something was missing. Maybe it was the growing distance that got to me. Jen had always been present, physically and emotionally. But lately, even when she was home, she seemed a bit more detached. Not cold, just distracted. I'd ask her about her weekend, and she'd say, "Oh, nothing exciting, just the usual." But the answers always felt vague, like there was more she wasn't telling me. I didn't suspect anything at first. Why would I? We had been together for almost 2 decades, and she had never given me a reason to doubt her. But after months of these regular trips, something in the back of my mind started to shift. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling. You know how sometimes you can't point to any one thing, but deep down, you know something isn't quite right? That's what it was like. Jen never acted suspiciously. If I asked about her time away, she'd tell me exactly what she did. Helping her mom with chores, running errands for her dad. Sometimes she'd mention seeing old family friends while she was out there. But that wasn't unusual. Jen grew up in that town. She knew everybody. And there was never any hint of secrecy. She wasn't hiding her phone or acting different. If anything, she was open about everything, always making sure I knew where she was and what she was doing. But even with all that, I couldn't shake this feeling that something was off. The more she went away, the more that doubt crept into my mind. I started to notice little changes. She'd get a bit more dressed up before heading out. Just small things like wearing a nicer blouse or taking more time with her hair. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was seeing her family, and maybe she wanted to look nice. But after a while, it felt like more than that. When she'd come back home, I'd ask her how her weekend was, and she'd give me the same answer every time. It was fine, just the usual. But the way she said it so casual, almost rehearsed, started to sound hollow. I wasn't sure if I was overthinking things. Maybe it was just stress, or maybe I was feeling insecure for no reason. After all, we'd been together for so long, and I'd never had a reason to doubt her before. Still, I couldn't help but wonder. There was this nagging thought in the back of my mind. What if? What if there was something going on that I didn't know about? What if those weekends away weren't just about helping her parents? I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Jen had never been anything but faithful and transparent. She wasn't the type to cheat, and besides, we had too much history together. We were a team, but the more those weekends passed, the more that little seed of doubt grew. I didn't want to confront her because I wasn't even sure what I'd be accusing her of. And the last thing I wanted was to start a fight over something that might be nothing. So I let it go for the time being. I told myself I was just imagining things, that it was all in my head. After all, there was no proof, no concrete reason to doubt her. And Jen? She continued with her weekends away, always coming back like nothing had changed. But something had changed. I just didn't know what yet. That uneasy feeling I'd been carrying around for months finally got some weight behind it about 2 weeks ago. I was home early from work, trying to fix a leak under the kitchen sink, when I heard Jen in the other room. She was talking on the phone, her voice low, almost like she didn't want me to hear. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. She had a lot of friends and was always chatting with someone, but something about the way she spoke that day caught my attention. I couldn't make out everything, but I heard her say something like, "I miss you too. I can't wait to see you again." Her tone was soft, affectionate even. It was the kind of thing she used to say to me when we were dating. And then, just as I was straining to catch more, she lowered her voice even further and said, "You know we have to be careful. He doesn't suspect anything. He doesn't suspect anything." Those words hit me like a brick. I froze right there under the sink, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing. Jen had never given me a reason to doubt her. But those words, they didn't leave much room for misinterpretation. I finished tightening the pipe, trying to act like I hadn't overheard. But my mind was racing. Who was she talking to? And what didn't I suspect? I sat there, replaying the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there. But another part of me was scared of what I might find out if I asked the wrong question. Later that evening, when Jen came into the kitchen, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I had to know. "Hey, who were you talking to earlier?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, just a friend," she said, shrugging it off. "Why?" "I don't know," I said, forcing a smile. "You seem different. I overheard you say something about someone not suspecting something. What was that about?" Her face barely flickered. Jen was good at keeping her cool, I'll give her that. She laughed, shaking her head. "Mike, you're imagining things. I was talking to Steve. Remember him? My childhood friend from my parents' neighborhood. He's just going through some stuff, and I was offering him advice. It's nothing. Steve." The name didn't ring any immediate alarm bells, but the way she said it, so nonchalantly, made me suspicious. "I don't remember you mentioning Steve before," I said, trying to dig a little deeper. "Well, he's just an old friend," she replied smoothly, leaning against the counter. "We've known each other since we were kids. We used to hang out all the time when I stayed at my parents'. I didn't think it was a big deal, so I never brought him up. Trust me, there's nothing going on. He's just having a tough time, and I was being a good friend." She said it with such ease, like it was the most innocent thing in the world. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Why hadn't she ever mentioned this old friend before? And what was that line about me not suspecting anything? "I don't know, Jen," I said, scratching my head. It sounded like something more than just friendly advice. She sighed, crossing her arms. "You're overreacting, Mike. You know what? Why don't you come with me next time I visit my parents? You can meet Steve for yourself. See, there's nothing to worry about. How about this weekend? We'll drive down together, and you can see that I'm not hiding anything." I wasn't sure what to think. On one hand, her invitation seemed genuine, but on the other, I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that she was trying to throw me off. Still, the idea of seeing this Steve guy in person sounded like a chance to figure out what was really going on. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But I agreed to go with her, hoping it would clear the air. That Friday, we packed up the car and headed to her parents' place. Jen seemed relaxed the whole ride, chatting about what her mom and dad had been up to, how her dad's health was improving, and how much she was looking forward to a quiet weekend away. She didn't seem nervous at all, which just confused me more. If she was hiding something, she sure didn't act like it. When we arrived, her parents greeted us with the usual warmth, inviting us inside for coffee. Her mom, a sweet but talkative woman, wasted no time in catching us up on all the neighborhood gossip. I sat there trying to be polite, but all I could think about was Steve. Where was he? After about an hour, Jen's dad casually mentioned, Steve's headed off to Italy for work. That boy's always traveling these days. You just missed him by a day or two. Italy. So, he wasn't even going to be around. That took the wind out of my sails a bit. I had built up this whole scenario in my head where I'd meet this guy, shake his hand, and maybe catch a hint of something suspicious. But now, there'd be no Steve to meet, no awkward interaction to analyze. That's right, Jen's mom chimed in. Steve's such a hard worker. He's done so well for himself. He's always been such a good friend to Jenny. We're so proud of him. I don't know how he finds the time to keep in touch with how busy he is, but he's always been a loyal friend. I tried to smile, but the way her parents went on about him, praising him like he was some golden boy, only made me more confused. They seemed to think the world of him. Jen, too, played along like it was all perfectly normal. She was chatting with her mom about Steve's new job like it was just another day, while I sat there trying to figure out what was real and what was a lie. I didn't know what to think anymore. On the one hand, Steve wasn't even around, and Jen had been totally open about me coming with her. But on the other hand, the conversation I overheard kept replaying in my mind. Was I being paranoid? Was it all in my head? Her parents certainly didn't seem to think there was anything unusual about Steve. The rest of the weekend went by in a blur. Jen acted like everything was completely normal, and if there was something going on, she hid it well. I kept waiting for something, some slip, some clue that would confirm my suspicions, but there was nothing. Just a quiet weekend with her family, filled with the usual stories and small talk. By the time we headed home on Sunday, I felt more confused than ever. I hadn't found any answers, but I hadn't found anything concrete to worry about either. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Maybe Jen really was just a loyal friend to Steve, and that phone call had been innocent after all. But that doubt, that little seed that had been planted, wasn't going away. We drove back home from her parents' place on Sunday afternoon. Jen was her usual chatty self, going on about what her mom said about the neighbors and the family news, but I barely heard a word. My mind was still stuck on Steve. No matter how normal everything seemed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Steve, this guy I'd never even heard about until now, yet he seemed to be a regular part of Jen's life, at least according to her and her parents. The fact that I had never once thought about him, let alone met him, felt like a red flag in itself. Sure, Jen had a right to have friends, and I wasn't the kind of husband who needed to know every detail of her life. But something about Steve didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the fact that he existed. It was how she had never mentioned him once in all these years. I kept thinking about the way her parents talked about him, how they seemed so fond of him. The more they praised him, the more uneasy I felt. Why was he such a big part of her life? And yet I knew next to nothing about him. In that conversation, I overheard. Who else could she have been talking about when she said, "He doesn't suspect anything"? Jen, of course, was playing everything cool. It was almost too perfect. She wasn't hiding her phone. She had invited me to her parents' house with zero hesitation. Everything was laid out so casually, so openly, that it made me question whether I was losing my mind. If there was something going on, she was doing an incredible job of covering it up. As we pulled into the driveway and unloaded the car, she smiled at me like everything was perfectly fine. And maybe, for her, she had this way of brushing off anything that felt heavy or serious, always making me feel like I was the one overthinking things. That night, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me. I thought about how long she'd been taking those weekend trips, how she'd always made it seem like it was all about her parents. And now this Steve was in the picture, and I couldn't figure out where he fit. I tried to be rational about it. I told myself there was probably nothing going on, that Jen was just a good friend, and maybe I was making something out of nothing. After all, she hadn't done anything suspicious. She wasn't secretive with her phone, didn't act guilty or nervous. She invited me to come with her to her parents' house, for crying out loud. If she were hiding something, why would she do that? But no matter how much I tried to talk myself down, that conversation I overheard kept replaying in my head. He doesn't suspect anything. I couldn't get past that. I'd been suspicious ever since that moment. And the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that there was more to this Steve situation than she was letting on. The next few days were strange. I tried to act normal around Jen, but every time she mentioned her parents or the town she grew up in, my stomach tightened. I knew she'd be planning another weekend trip soon, and I didn't know if I could handle the idea of her being gone again, possibly spending time with Steve while I sat at home like a fool. Finally, a few days later, the inevitable happened. "So I'm thinking about heading to Mom and Dad's this weekend," Jen said one evening as she cleared the dishes from the dinner table. "Mom's been having a hard time with her arthritis, and Dad could use some help in the yard." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you going alone?" "Well, yeah. I thought you want to stay here with the kids. Besides, you've been so busy with work lately." I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I couldn't let it go. "What about Steve? Is he going to be around?" She looked at me, and for just a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. But then she smiled, casual as ever. "I don't know. Probably not. He's always traveling for work." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I said, shrugging, trying to play it off. "You're not still worried about that, are you?" she asked, walking over and giving me a playful nudge. "I told you, there's nothing going on. Steve's just an old friend. You can call him yourself if you want to. I can give you his number. I'm sure he'd love to meet you next time he's in town." She made it sound so simple, so innocent, and maybe it was, but something about the way she brushed it off made my suspicions worse. She was too calm, too collected, like she had the whole situation under control, and I was the one making a big deal out of nothing. "I believe you," I lied. I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. That weekend, Jen packed her things and headed out to her parents' place like usual. I tried to act normal, playing with the kids, doing stuff around the house, but I couldn't shake the thought of her being with Steve, or at least seeing him while she was there. I imagined them together, talking, laughing, and, God, I didn't even want to think about it. Sunday evening rolled around, and Jen came back home, just like she always did, as if everything was perfectly normal. She walked through the door, kissed me on the cheek, and dropped her bags by the door like nothing had changed. "How was the weekend?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Good. Mom's doing better, and Dad finally got the yard work done. It was nice to spend some time with them." She smiled and leaned against the counter. "Oh, and I didn't see Steve at all, by the way. He's in Europe for a month or so. Something work-related." "Europe. So, he wasn't even around." Part of me felt relieved, but another part of me felt like I had been chasing a ghost. I didn't know whether to be happy that she hadn't seen him or frustrated that I was still left with no real answers. We sat down for dinner, and she started telling me stories about her parents, about how her mom's arthritis had been acting up and how her dad was planning some renovations on their house. She even mentioned how much her parents missed having Steve around. Her dad had said something like, "Steve's such a good kid. I hope he comes back soon." Her mom had chimed in too, saying how much they all loved him, how he was practically family. I smiled and nodded, but inside, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Everyone seemed to love Steve. Everyone talked about him like he was some perfect, harmless guy. But if that was true, why did I feel like there was something dark lurking beneath the surface? Why did Jen say those words? "He doesn't suspect anything." If there was nothing to hide, it was like being stuck in a maze with no way out. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that nothing was going on. But every time I tried to let it go, that doubt crept back in. And as much as I hated to admit it, I knew deep down that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I wish I could say I let it go after that weekend, that I believed Jen's story about Steve being in Europe, her parents' innocent praise of him, and how everything was just a coincidence. But I couldn't. That feeling in my gut had grown too strong to ignore. Something was off. I wasn't imagining it anymore. The following week, I started paying more attention to Jen. Not in an obvious way. No, I didn't want to tip her off that I was still suspicious. But I watched her, took note of the little things she did. Her phone, for instance. She was always open about it. Always left it on the kitchen counter or in the living room. Never once acting like she had anything to hide. But now it seemed a little too perfect. I realized she never texted or called Steve in front of me. If she was talking to him, it was when I wasn't around. I couldn't prove anything yet, though. and I didn't want to confront her without concrete evidence. So I decided to do something I never thought I would. I'd keep track of when she left the house. Jen had another visit to her parents planned that weekend. Same excuse as always. Her mom needed help. Her dad could use the extra hands. This time, though, I was going to dig a little deeper. On Saturday afternoon, while the kids were at their friend's house and I was working in my home office, I decided to check Jen's emails. It was a low move, I know, but I had reached a point where I needed answers. My mind was eating itself alive with doubt, and I couldn't take it anymore. If I found nothing, fine, I'd let it go. But if I found something, well, I'd deal with that when it came. I opened her laptop, hoping she wouldn't have logged out of anything. And there it was, her inbox, wide open. At first, it looked like the usual stuff. Emails from her mom, random store promotions, reminders for PDA meetings. But then, buried in the middle of her inbox, I saw it. An email with a subject line that read, "Miss you already," from someone named Steve. My heart stopped. I clicked it open, and there it was in black and white, the proof I had been dreading. The email was short but intimate. He wrote about how he couldn't wait to see her again, how their time together had been incredible, and how hard it was being away from her. He ended it with, "I'm counting the days until we're together again. Love you, Steve." I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. It was real. All this time, I had been hoping I was wrong, that I was just being paranoid. But here it was, staring me in the face. Jen had been lying to me. She was having an affair, and Steve wasn't just some old friend. He was something more. I sat there for what felt like hours, the words on the screen burning into my brain. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. How long had this been going on? How many of those weekends at her parents' were really about him? And worse, how could she have looked me in the eye, told me there was nothing going on, and invited me to meet him, knowing what she was doing behind my back? I couldn't even feel anger yet. I just felt numb, betrayed, confused. But then, as I sat there, it started to click. The phone conversation I had overheard. The way her parents had casually mentioned Steve. Her insistence that everything was fine. It all fell into place, and I felt like the biggest idiot for not seeing it sooner. She had played me perfectly skillfully, without even breaking a sweat. And I had fallen for it. Suddenly, the numbness gave way to anger. How could she do this to me? After nearly 2 decades together, after everything we had built, our home, our family, our life. I had trusted her, loved her, and she had torn that trust apart like it was nothing. I wanted to confront her, call her out, make her face the truth. But at the same time, I knew I had to play it smart. I closed the laptop, my mind racing. I needed to figure out my next move. Confronting her right now, while she was at her parents', wouldn't do any good. She'd deny it, probably even twist things around to make it seem like I was the one in the wrong. No, I needed to catch her in a lie that she couldn't wriggle out of. I needed to see it for myself, face to face. That night, when she called to check in on me and the kids, I played it cool. I didn't let on that I knew. I even asked her how her mom was doing, listened to her talk about how she'd be home late Sunday like always. It took everything I had not to explode right then and there. But I managed. Barely. When she came home the next day, she acted like nothing had changed. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and told me she missed me. I wanted to scream at her, to ask her how she could lie so easily, but I held back. I needed a plan. For the next week, I tried to act normal, even though I was dying inside. Every time she looked at me, I wondered if she was thinking about him. Every time she left the room, I wondered if she was texting him. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus at work. All I could think about was catching her, making her admit the truth. Then Friday came, and she casually mentioned, "I might head to my parents again this weekend. Mom needs help with a few things." This was it, my opportunity. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. "But this time, why don't you stay here on Sunday night? I'll drive down and pick you up. It'll save you the trouble of driving back." She hesitated, just for a second, but then smiled. "That's sweet. Sure, why not?" I knew she wouldn't see it coming. I'd drive down on Sunday, early, and see for myself. See if Steve was there, see what was really happening behind closed doors. She couldn't deny it if I caught her in the act. That Sunday, I left the house hours before I told her I'd be there. I drove straight to her parents' neighborhood, parked a few blocks away, and waited. My heart was pounding in my chest, my palms sweating. I wasn't sure what I was about to walk into, but I knew I needed to see it for myself. When I finally worked up the courage, I walked toward her parents' house, trying to stay calm. As I approached, I saw a car parked outside, a car I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped. I moved closer, and through the window, I saw them, Jen and Steve, together, sitting on the couch, talking like they were the only two people in the world. And then, as if to drive the final nail into my chest, he leaned over and kissed her. That was it. The truth, right in front of me. Seeing them together, it felt like a train hit me full force. I had prepared myself for this moment, replayed it over and over in my mind, but nothing could prepare me for how gut-wrenching it was to witness it firsthand. There was no denying it now. Jennifer, the woman I had loved and trusted for nearly 2 decades, was cheating on me. I didn't make a scene. I didn't burst through the door or confront them in some dramatic showdown. Instead, I turned away, retreating back to my car in a daze. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. It was all too real now. I had to figure out what to do next. The drive back home was a blur. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, but another part knew that I needed to be smart about this. I couldn't just rush in with raw emotion and expect anything but chaos. No, I needed to think this through. I needed a plan, just like I had when I first started suspecting her. When I got home, I sat in the car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel and staring blankly ahead. How had it come to this? Jennifer and I had built a life together, raised kids, and gone through the highs and lows that every couple experiences. We were supposed to be a team, and now it felt like she had been playing for the other side all along. I thought about the kids, Sarah and Josh. They were older now, almost adults, but they didn't deserve to be caught up in this mess. I couldn't imagine how this would affect them, learning that their mother had been living a double life. And what about her parents? They had been so casual about Steve, praising him like he was some golden boy. Did they know what was going on? Did they know their daughter was cheating on me with this childhood friend they adored so much? The more I thought about Jennifer's parents, the more questions swirled in my mind. Had they been in on it? I replayed the weekend we had just spent with them, how they talked about Steve as if he were a saint. Could they really have known about the affair and still praised him like that, knowing how much it would hurt me? No, I didn't think so. They weren't that kind of people. They probably had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. To them, Steve was just a hard-working guy who had grown up with their daughter, someone they had known since he was a kid. They probably thought nothing of his relationship with Jennifer because, in their eyes, it was just old friends reconnecting. But Jennifer had weaponized that trust, hadn't she? She had used her parents' approval of Steve to cover her tracks. Every time I asked about him, she had the perfect excuse. He's just a friend from my childhood. It was brilliant in a twisted way, hiding in plain sight, knowing that no one would question their relationship because of the history they shared. Her parents weren't accomplices. They were simply unwitting pawns in her deceit. I took a deep breath, my anger slowly building as I processed everything. It wasn't just the affair that stung. It was the calculated way Jennifer had manipulated everyone around her, including me. She had built this elaborate web of lies and made sure everyone played their part without even knowing it. But now it was time for me to take control. I knew I couldn't confront Jennifer without solid proof. Sure, I had seen them together, but I needed more. I needed undeniable evidence that she couldn't explain away or twist to make herself the victim. If I was going to confront her, I wanted to make sure she had no way out. The next day, I called a private investigator. I didn't like the idea of spying on my wife, but this was different. I needed to protect myself, especially with the divorce looming in my mind. I didn't want to be caught off guard or lose everything I had worked for because of her betrayal. The investigator, a man named Frank, assured me he could get the evidence I needed. He was discreet, professional, and had handled cases like this before. I gave him all the details, Jennifer's trips to her parents, her connection with Steve, and my suspicions about when and where they met. "I'll start right away," Frank said. "Give me a week, maybe 2, and I'll have everything you need." In the meantime, I tried to act normal around Jennifer. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to play the part. If she suspected that I knew about the affair, she might try to cover her tracks or deny everything. So, I pretended like everything was fine, even though every time I looked at her, I felt like I was staring at a stranger. At night, while she slept beside me, I found myself replaying our entire marriage in my mind. How long had this been going on? Was Steve her first affair, or had there been others? Was our entire relationship built on lies? I couldn't believe I hadn't seen it sooner. But looking back, the signs were there. The increasing distance, the vague explanations the weekend away. She had been careful, though, never slipping up enough for me to suspect anything serious. Until that phone call. That was the moment everything changed. 2 weeks later, Frank called me. He had the evidence. It's all there, he said. Photos, texts, emails. You name it, I've got it. I arranged to meet him and went over everything. The photos showed Jennifer and Steve meeting at a hotel, not far from her parents' house. There were multiple instances of them together, enough to prove that this wasn't just a one-time fling. The texts and emails were even worse. Explicit messages detailing their relationship, their plans, and their feelings for each other. It was all there in black and white. With this evidence, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't been imagining things. Jennifer had been lying to me, and now I had the proof to confront her. That evening, I waited until the kids were out of the house. I didn't want them to witness what was about to happen. When Jennifer came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the envelope of evidence in front of me. "Hey, Mike," she said, smiling as she walked in. "What's for dinner?" I didn't smile back. "We need to talk." She paused, sensing the seriousness in my voice. "Okay, what's going on?" I gestured for her to sit down. She looked confused, but she did as I asked. "I know about you and Steve," I said, my voice steady. Her face went pale. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at me in shock. "I don't," she started, but I cut her off. "Don't lie to me, Jennifer. I've got all the proof I need. The photos, the emails, the texts. Everything." I slid the envelope across the table toward her. She stared at it, her hands shaking as she opened it. She flipped through the photos, her face crumbling with each one. There was no denying it now. "Mike, she choked on her words. "I'm sorry. Sorry," I said, my voice rising. "You've been lying to me for God knows how long, cheating on me with this guy, and you think sorry is going to fix this?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel sympathy. Not anymore. I had given her everything, my love, my trust, my loyalty, and she had thrown it all away for what? For Steve? How long, Jennifer? How long have you been doing this? She wiped her eyes, struggling to speak. "It started about a year ago. It wasn't supposed to go this far, Mike. It just happened." "It didn't just happen," I shot back. "You made a choice. Every time you lied to me, every time you went to see him, you chose him over me." She broke down, sobbing at the kitchen table. But I didn't care. I couldn't care. The damage was done, and there was no going back. "I'm filing for divorce," I said coldly. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. You can keep seeing Steve for all I care, but we're done." "Please, Mike," she cried. "Don't do this. Don't leave me. We can fix this." I stood up, unable to listen to her anymore. "You've already destroyed us, Jennifer. There's nothing left to fix." The hardest part came next, telling Sarah and Josh. I didn't want to drag them into this, but they deserved to know the truth. They were old enough to understand, and I wasn't going to let Jennifer spin some false narrative about why our marriage had ended. I sat them down one evening, after Jennifer had moved out. They looked confused, worried, sensing that something was wrong. "What's going on, Dad?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet. I took a deep breath. "Your mom and I are getting a divorce." Their faces fell, shock and sadness washing over them. "Why?" Josh asked, his voice shaky. "What happened?" "There's no easy way to say this," I began. "Your mom has been seeing someone else. She's been having an affair." Their reactions were immediate. Tears, anger, confusion. I explained everything as gently as I could, but there was no sugarcoating it. Jennifer had betrayed not just me, but them as well. She had torn our family apart, and now we had to deal with the aftermath. They had a lot of questions, most of which I didn't have answers to. Why did she do it? How long had it been going on? Did she even love us anymore? I tried my best to reassure them that it wasn't their fault, that their mom still loved them, but I couldn't lie to them about the situation. They deserved the truth, no matter how painful it was. In the months that followed, Jennifer and I finalized our divorce. It wasn't pretty, but with the evidence I had, the process went smoothly enough. I got the house, custody arrangements were made, and Jennifer moved in with Steve, at least for a while. Last I heard, they were having problems. No surprise there. As for me, life went on. It wasn't easy at first. The house felt empty, even with the kids around. I had built my life around Jennifer, and now I had to figure out who I was without her. But in a strange way, I started to feel free. Free from the lies, the doubt, the constant second-guessing. I had been living in her shadow for too long, and now I could finally step out of it. I focused on the kids, on rebuilding my relationship with them. It took time, but we got through it together. They were hurt, of course, but they were strong. We were strong. Eventually, I started dating again. It was awkward at first, trying to navigate a world I hadn't been part of in nearly 20 years. But I met someone who had been through a similar betrayal. We took things slow, learning to trust each other after the pain we had both experienced. Looking back, I realized that Jennifer's betrayal had changed me. It had hardened me in some ways, but it had also taught me about resilience. I learned that life doesn't always go the way you planned, but that doesn't mean you can't rebuild. You just have to be willing to pick up the pieces and start over. And that's exactly what I did. A year after the divorce, I found myself sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The kids were visiting for the weekend, laughing inside the house. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. I had survived the storm that Jennifer had brought into my life, and now, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. Jennifer? She was just a part of my past now, a chapter that had ended. And as I sat there, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, I knew that, finally, I was ready for whatever came next.